for $50. A lonely cowboy. Bought a ranch, and was shocked to find 3 Apache women waiting there, the land stretched wide and empty beneath the pale morning sky, a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on the earth itself. Dust drifted across the barren road, as if the wind had grown tired of carrying it. Not a bird called, not a dog barked. The stillness belonged to a place abandoned by time, where fences leaned inward and roofs sagged under the weight of years. A cowboy rode slowly along that forgotten road, his shoulders slouched, his hat pulled low to shield his face from the sharp light. He wasn't young anymore. The weight of winters and losses hung in the way he carried himself, in the way his eyes scanned the land without expectation. His name was William, though he had not spoken it aloud in weeks. He had bought the ranch for $50, a price too low not to raise suspicion, but he had not cared. To him, the land was only a place to disappear. When he reached the gate, he stopped. The wooden posts leaned, their paint long stripped by wind. The sign above it was half gone, the letters eaten by weather. The cabin beyond stood grey and silent, smoke long since absent from its chimney. He dismounted, his boots sinking into dry soil, the creak of leather loud in the hush. The place smelled of dust and ash, of something left behind too long. William pushed the cabin door open, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was colder, carrying the faint scent of damp wood. His eyes adjusted slowly to the dim. That was when he saw them. 3 figures sat against the far wall, their backs pressed to the rough boards. They were women. Apache by their braided hair and dark eyes, their clothes torn and soiled with travel. They did not move, though their eyes followed him with guarded stillness. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence carried a weight sharper than any words. William's hand hovered near his belt but did not draw. He could feel the fear in the room, not his own, but theirs, coiled tight like a spring that might snap. What had he bought for $50? A ranch, or a secret that would change everything? The 3 women did not speak. Their eyes shifted between him, cautious as animals cornered in the wild. The eldest looked no older than 30, her face lined not by age but by exhaustion. The second carried the hollow cheeks of hunger. The third was scarcely more than a girl, her wrists marked with red indentations where rope had once been tied. Their silence was not empty. It was heavy, filled with all that had been done to them and all they feared might come next. William stood frozen near the door, his chest tight as if the air had thickened around him. He had not expected company, let alone this. For years he had lived avoiding the sight of another's pain, telling himself it was easier to walk past than to become entangled. Yet here it was, staring back at him, demanding something more than indifference. He could almost hear his own breath echoing in the cabin, too loud in the stillness. A flicker of memory pressed into him without warning. A boy of 10, standing on a porch, while his mother wept quietly inside. His father had been taken by sickness, leaving nothing but debt and silence behind. Neighbors had passed, some curious, some pitying, but none had stopped to help. William had felt the same helpless stare these women carried now, the same ache of being abandoned to fate. It was not a memory he often touched. Yet, in their faces, it returned with a sting sharper than cold wind. He shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking under his boots. Part of him whispered to leave. He could walk out, ride away, pretend he had never opened that door. $50 had not promised him this burden. No one would, and question his silence. But another part, deeper and older, gnawed at him with a voice he could not quiet. If he left, he would become no different from those neighbors who had watched a boy fall, silent on his porch years ago. The eldest woman's gaze did not waver. She did not plead, yet her eyes spoke more than words could. The younger one tried to hide her wrists beneath her skirt, ashamed of the marks that revealed too much. The girl shifted slightly, as if bracing for whatever fate he might choose. William's jaw clenched, and his hand curled into a fist at his side. The choice was simple in words, but heavy in consequence. walk away, and the memory of them would follow him like a shadow. Stay, and he would inherit a danger he could not yet see. The silence between them stretched like a rope drawn taut, waiting to break. Then, slowly, William pulled the door shut behind him, cutting off the chance of escape. Whatever they were, whatever had been done to them, he would not abandon them. Not this time. The silence did not last long. William knew it could not. By evening, the women's fear had begun to sharpen into something else, a trembling watchfulness that hinted of danger beyond the cabin walls. They did not eat, though he placed bread on the table. They did not speak, though he offered water. Instead, they sat with their backs close to the wall, as though listening for something he could not yet hear. It was the youngest who gave him the first clue. When a horse neighed somewhere beyond the hills, she stiffened, her hands gripping her skirt so tight the knuckles whitened. The eldest touched her shoulder, whispering words too soft to catch, but William had seen enough to know. Whoever had left them here had not gone far. As dusk bled into night, William stepped outside, his boots crunching over the dry soil. The sky was the color of ash, streaked with fire at the horizon. From that edge of light, he caught a faint glimmer, smoke rising, too steady to be an accident. A campfire. Men were near. When he returned inside, the eldest finally spoke, her voice low and brittle, the English broken but clear enough. They had been taken from their people, she said, traded like cattle to men who wanted land and obedience both. When the ranch was sold, the women were left behind, unwanted but not forgotten. The men would return to collect what they still believed was theirs. William felt the weight of her words settle like iron across his chest. He had not bought a ranch. He had bought into another man's sin. The walls seemed thinner with every passing moment, the door no stronger than a sheet of paper. The second woman lifted her sleeve, showing bruises that darkened her arm like spilled ink. William turned his face, shame burning his throat, though the marks were not his doing. He asked no questions. He had seen enough of cruelty in his years to know how little explanation it required. Outside, the night deepened, carrying with it a hush that felt less like silence and more like waiting. William cleaned his rifle by lamplight, the sound of metal on cloth the only voice in the cabin. The three women sat in the shadows watching him, their faces pale in the flickering light. He could sense their mistrust, but beneath it, something else, a thin thread of hope, frayed but still clinging. Somewhere in the dark, men would be saddling their horses, drawing closer with every hour. William could almost hear the hooves already, beating like a second heartbeat beneath his ribs. Time was running out. By morning, the threat would be at his door, and whether he wished it or not, he and the three women would face it together. Morning came cold and brittle, the air carrying the weight of what waited beyond the hills. Yet inside the cabin, something had shifted. The women no longer sat huddled against the wall, though their fear had not vanished. They moved carefully, as if unsure of the ground beneath them, but they watched William with a different kind of silence now, one that measured, tested, and waited. William began with the simplest of gestures. He set the bread back on the table, this time cutting it into even pieces and placing them before the women without a word. The youngest reached for hers, hesitant, her dark eyes flicking to his face as though to catch the trick. When he did nothing, when he simply turned to pour water into the tin cups, she ate in small bites, quick and hungry. The eldest gave a slight nod, not of thanks, but of acknowledgement. It was enough. Later, when the sound of distant hooves stirred the edge of the wind, William stepped outside with his rifle. He hesitated, then called softly to the eldest. She did not answer at first, but curiosity drew her to the doorway. Without speaking, he lifted the rifle, aimed at a fence post, and fired. The shot cracked through the morning. Then he held the rifle out, the barrel lowered. She studied him, her face unreadable, before stepping forward and taking it. Her hands knew the weight. She steadied, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck close enough to splinter the wood. William allowed himself the faintest nod. In that silence, a kind of respect passed between them. By noon, the second woman had begun to sweep the floor with a bundle of twigs, her movements brisk, almost defiant, as though claiming a space she had been denied. William carried in wood for the fire, and when his sleeve fell back, the edge of an old scar caught the light. A line across his forearm, pale and jagged. He saw the youngest watching and pulled his sleeve back down, but the moment lingered. They had seen wounds before. They carried their own. That night, they sat by the small fire. No words, only the sound of wood crackling and the faint whistle of wind through the boards. William stared into the flames, remembering a battlefield years ago, the screams lost in smoke, the faces he had left behind. He wondered if the women thought of their own losses in the same way, faces pressed into memory, carried like stones that could never be put down. For a few moments, the fear outside seemed distant. There was only firelight, bread shared, and a rifle leaning ready against the wall. It felt like the stillness before a storm, fragile yet strangely human, as if 4 broken souls had found a breath of peace together in the quiet hours before the world returned to claim them. The night was darker than any William could remember, the sky swallowed by thick clouds that smothered even the stars. The cabin sat in a hush that felt too sharp, as if the earth itself held its breath. Then came the sound, distant at first, then growing. Hooves beating the ground in rhythm, voices carried by the wind, the crack of laughter that held no joy. The women stiffened instantly, their eyes turning to him. They knew. The men had come. William's grip tightened on his rifle as he stepped to the window. Lanterns bobbed along the road, 5, maybe 6 riders drawing closer. The eldest woman's voice whispered behind him, low and heavy. "They will take us." She said no more, but the tremor in her words told him everything. When the riders stopped at the gate, silence returned for a brief heartbeat. Then a voice rose, harsh and commanding. "Open up, old man! That property's ours, and so is what's inside!" Another joined with a mocking laugh, the kind that cut through the cold like a knife. William's chest burned, not with fear, but with the same helpless anger he had known as a boy, when no one came to save his mother. He pushed the women back toward the wall and whispered one word. "Stay." They did not move, their dark eyes fixed on him as though he were already a ghost. The door shuddered under a hard knock. William swung it open, rifle raised. The men on the porch sneered at the sight of him, their faces rough with drink and arrogance. "Step aside, old man," one spat. "Ain't no fight worth dying for them." William's voice was steady, though his heart hammered Lichi thunder. "You sold me this land. Whatever you left here is no longer yours." The standoff thickened, each breath drawn sharp as glass. One man drew his pistol, but William's barrel was already steady on him. Behind the leader, the others shifted, hungry for violence. Then came the twist. Among them stood a boy no older than 16, his features too soft for the cruelty he followed. William's stomach turned. He saw himself in that boy, the same hollow obedience, the same silent surrender to stronger wills. For a moment, his aim faltered. It was the eldest woman who steadied him. From the shadows inside, she lifted the rifle he had taught her to hold. The barrel gleamed faintly in the lamplight. William felt her presence like a hand on his back. They were not alone. The first shot cracked through the night. William did not remember pulling the trigger, only the thunder that followed. Chaos erupted at the gate, horses rearing, men cursing, gunfire sparking across the dark. He moved not for himself, but for the women behind him, each step a vow that he would not surrender them, not even if it meant his own blood soaking into the dust. When the smoke began to clear, William stood in the doorway, chest heaving, the women behind him silent as stone. The men had not all fallen, but they had scattered, dragging their wounded into the night. William knew they would return, but for this night at least, the women were still his to protect, and he had staked his life to prove it. Smoke hung low across the clearing, clinging to the air like a veil that refused to lift. The acrid sting of gunpowder burned William's throat as he lowered his rifle. The echoes of shots still seemed to tremble through the hills, though silence had already taken their place. A horse screamed in the distance, the sound fading into the night until only the hollow wind remained. William stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, the weight of every breath heavier than the last. His eyes searched the darkness for movement, half expecting the riders to return. But they did not. Lanterns that had once bobbed like fireflies were gone, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the land. Only the broken gate and churned earth bore witness to what had passed. Inside, the cabin held its own silence. The eldest woman still gripped the rifle, her knuckles pale, her breath ragged. The younger two clung to each other, their faces streaked with fear and ash. William's gaze met theirs, and for a moment no words were needed. He saw in their eyes the same fragile disbelief that pulsed in his chest. They had survived, though none could yet explain how. He stepped out into the yard, boots sinking into soil darkened by blood. A body lay near the fence, a man whose arrogance had not outlasted the night. William knelt beside him, his jaw tight, not with triumph, but with the weary recognition of another life ended by the same cruelty that haunted them all. He covered the man's face with his hat, not as forgiveness, but as a final gesture to silence the violence. The eldest woman joined him, her steps slow, her face drawn in shadows. She did not speak, but together they dragged the body to the edge of the field, laying it beneath the open sky. The earth was too hard to dig, the night too short to finish the work. Still, they stood there for a long while, as though the silence itself was a kind of burial. Back in the cabin, the fire had burned low, casting weak light across the room. William leaned his rifle against the wall and sank onto the floorboards. The youngest girl moved first, edging closer until she sat across from him, her eyes wide but calmer now. She held her wrists against her lap, the red marks fading in the dim glow. William let his head rest against the wall, too tired for words, too tired even for thought. The cabin breathed with them in the stillness. No victory, no celebration, only survival. The threat had passed, but the weight of what had been done, of what might still cease, lingered like smoke in their lungs. In that silence, something fragile yet unspoken took root. The understanding that none of them were alone anymore, not even in the emptiest corner of the world. Days stretched into weeks, and the land seemed to breathe differently once the riders were gone. The cabin, once a hollow shell, began to carry the sounds of life again, the scrape of chairs against the floor, the crackle of fire, the quiet rhythm of hands working together. It was not laughter, not yet, but it was not silence either. William repaired the gate first. Each strike of the hammer echoed through the valley, as though telling the earth that the ground belonged to them now. The eldest woman helped stack wood for the winter, her eyes softer when they met his. The second tended to the fire, her bruises fading but her movements still sharp, as if daring the world to strike again. The youngest followed William closely, watching how he saddled the horse, how he checked the rifle, as though memorizing the quiet rituals of survival. They did not speak much. Words were fragile things, easily broken, and trust was built slower than fences. Yet in their silence, a bond grew. William no longer ate alone. The cabin no longer felt like a place to disappear, but like a place where broken lives stitched themselves together in small, unseen ways. On the far edge of the field, beneath the oak that leaned crooked in the wind, William and the women buried the man who had fallen that night. They dug into hard earth, each scoop of soil heavy with more than weight. When the grave was filled, they stood without prayer, without anger, only a solemn stillness. The ground took him, and with it, some piece of their fear. Seasons shifted. Winter crept in with frost at the windows, and spring promised green shoots across the barren field. The world outside remained harsh, but inside the cabin something fragile endured. They were no longer strangers bound by accident. They were survivors bound by choice. William often stood at the doorway at dusk, watching the horizon. Once he had caught me to this land seeking to vanish. Now, he stayed because 3 lives depended on him, and perhaps his own life did too. The prairie stretched endless, yet for the first time, it did not feel empty. And when night fell, carrying its hush across the land, the silence that settled over the cabin was no longer hollow. It was full, like the last note of a violin lingering in the air long after the music had ceased.